Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the NARUC Center for Partnerships and Innovation webinar series. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into lessons learned in applying performance incentive mechanisms. Just a couple housekeeping remarks. My name is Carrie Worthington. I'm on the CPI staff, and we have a couple of speakers today that you can see on the screen. They will go through their presentations, and throughout the presentation, please feel free to send in clarifying questions. And then at the end, we will be taking questions from the audience as a whole. And the way that you can submit questions is through either the questions or the chat box. And those messages will get sent straight to me, and I will be able to forward those on to the speakers and moderator. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Marianne Gold from the Rhode Island Public Utility Commission to get our conversation started. Commissioner Gold?
Okay, thanks, Carrie, and welcome, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. I am personally really excited to hear from our presenters today as we consider what we can learn from past efforts to use performance incentive mechanisms to enhance utility regulation. It's a topic that we've been giving a great deal of thought to in Rhode Island, and it can be very complicated as well as full of promise. Regulators across the United States have a long history with using performance incentives. In most parts of the country, as you all know, performance incentives have been used to meet traditional regulatory goals, things like reliability and service quality. But more recently, we're thinking about using performance incentives as a tool to better align private sector goals with a much broader set of public sector interests. So we have a really terrific lineup today to dive into this topic. Our first presenter is Peter Kappers, and Pete is a research scientist in the Electricity Markets and Policy Group at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And for the past 17 years, he's been doing research and providing technical assistance to regulators and other policymakers on a whole range of topics, including electric utility regulation and business models, demand response, renewable energy, and energy efficiency policy issues. Pete is going to provide an overview and some thoughts on how we can use performance incentive mechanisms to drive utility performance. And then our second presenter will be my colleague, Commissioner Abigail Anthony. Brief bio: Abigail was appointed to the Commission by Governor Gina Raimondo in June of 2017, and she now serves as the co-vice chair of NARUC's Committee on Energy Resources and the Environment. Before that, she was the director of the Acadia Center's Grid Modernization and Utility Reform Initiative. And Abigail's going to talk about some of our recent experiences with performance incentives in Rhode Island. Pete's going to go first, and then we'll take a brief break after his presentation if you have questions, clarifying questions or other questions, and then Abigail will deliver her presentation, and then we can have a discussion. So with that, Pete, take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Commissioner Gold. I want to thank the folks at NARUC for inviting me to come speak today. As mentioned in the bio, I have provided a fair amount of technical assistance to a number of different states in this area of performance incentive mechanisms. And so I think it's important, though, to understand where PIMs fit within the broader landscape of various types of mechanisms and approaches to ultimately drive utility performance improvements. And so I really want to set the stage for that and use that as a backdrop to kind of get to the point at the end of the presentation of, well, where do PIMs fit? Why should you as a regulator, want to pursue PIMs relative to some of these other alternative approaches? What are some of the design considerations that might suggest pursuing PIMs relative to these other approaches? And then end with sort of this a bit of a broader perspective on what has been some illustrations or some experiences thus far in our industry with PIMs and their success or relative success in driving that utility performance improvements that clearly the Commission was seeking. So with that, let's get started. So next slide, please. So cost of service regulation, right? I mean, all of you here know far more about it than I do, but my limited understanding of it, really focuses on this idea that when we talk about performance of a utility, their performance is really judged from the perspective of delivering safe and reliable electricity at least cost. And there's a number of different ways in which that can be done. Regulatory lag and infrequent rate cases are there really to improve efficiency. used in useful doctrines and determinations are really there to ensure prudent utility investment. And so cost of service really is driving specific performance around that idea of safe, reliable, and electricity at least cost. But if we go to the next slide, we know that utility performance actually encompasses a tremendous number of other areas of interest, right? Affordability, DER adoption, grid investment efficiency, all of these things, can be deemed elements of utility performance. On the next slide, the challenge that we have with cost of service regulation is that there may be a misalignment of the goals, the performance goals, the areas of utility performance that a regulator seeks to improve or seeks to improve relative to the performance areas that a utility wants to focus their attention on. And so we need to deal with that misalignment potentially and figure out how to augment cost of service regulation. This is even more imperative if we move to the next slide, when we think about more recent interest in using the utility and their performance to drive broader market transformational changes. And so we're not only asking the utility to deal with their own house, but also seeking to improve the efficacy of other actors in this ecosystem of our electricity markets. And so in order for regulators to ultimately drive utility performance, whether it's specific to the utility or in the broader context of their interactions with markets, they first need to be able to specifically identify and articulate what are those areas of performance that really need to be the focus. So on the next slide, that's the first thing that really needs to be done in any sort of effort where you're beginning to think about PIMs. So the regulator really has to go out and identify these goals, and it needs to be on a very specific basis. However, in order to achieve those goals, we know that the utility is going to have to achieve particular outcomes. And so that's the next thing that needs to be done on the next slide. And these outcomes can be on a one-for-one basis with a goal, one outcome for one particular goal, but we oftentimes have multiple outcomes that illustrate the achievement of a particular goal. Now, in order to assess the utility's achievement of these outcomes, it's going to require some ability to measure their performance towards that outcome. And that introduces the idea of metrics because it necessitates the creation of some ability to measure that outcome. And again, these metrics can be on a one-for-one basis with an outcome, or there could be multiple metrics that are needed to really assess the ability or the ability for the utility to achieve that outcome that they're looking for. And so to make this a bit more concrete, let me show you an example of this hierarchy on the next slide. So it's been well understood for many, many years that cost of service regulation, because the utility is a monopoly provider, it's the one-stop shop, it's the only place customers have to go to get electricity, it means utilities don't necessarily have to be customer-centric. And so if a goal that is common across many regulatory commissions is improving or maintaining a positive and a beneficial customer experience, the outcomes that have been identified associated with that customer experience are reliability and service quality. And the metrics by which those achievement of those outcomes have been identified are things like SAIDI, right? The average interruption duration, or SAIFI, the average interruption frequency of events. When we talk about service quality, we've oftentimes focused on call centers and the time it takes to answer a call and get all the way through it. Since metrics form the foundation of this hierarchy, they're really critical for the assessment of utility performance, engaging the success or failure on the part of the utility to achieve some particular outcome and subsequently the goal. Now, there's three different types of metrics that can be developed, and I'll talk about each one in succession. So if you can go to the next slide, the first one are program-based metrics, and these are the ones probably most people are the most familiar with. These are metrics that are focused on a specific utility outcome that are achieved through a very specific and particular program or initiative. And oftentimes those programs or initiatives must be reviewed and approved by regulators. So the best example of this to me are energy efficiency programs, especially, and obviously where the utility is the administrator of those programs. they are on the hook for driving the achievement of savings outcomes. Now, as time has gone on, we've developed more and more effective, evaluation, measurement, and verification approaches. Those are all at the metrics level to understand the degree to which we actually achieve the outcome. We also know that in the energy efficiency area, there's lots of different types of outcomes that are increasingly of interest. Low income adoption or market transformation. Those all necessitate different types of metrics, but nonetheless are tied back to this energy efficiency program itself. The next type of metric on the next slide focuses on actions or activities that are necessary to get towards the achievement of a particular outcome. But that action or activity may not necessarily directly or may take some time to produce the desired outcome. So these action-based programs may be, action-based metrics, may be appropriate during transition phases. Where the outcome of the action may be a bit uncertain, or even the result of that action and the achievement of an outcome may to some degree be outside of the utility's direct control. And so to me, a good example of this has to do with the installation of EV charging stations. So if the goal, let's say, is carbon mitigation, the outcome that we're looking for to achieve that goal has to do with a conversion of internal combustion engines towards electric vehicles, so it's the increased adoption of electric vehicles. One activity that may be necessary to achieve that is more charging stations out there. And depending on how a commission sees this, a utility may have a role in investing in those and putting those charging stations out there. So this is a good example of an activity for which it doesn't necessarily, it will contribute to the adoption of electric vehicles, but finding a causal link or a direct link between the number of EV charging stations and the number of electric vehicles coming on board isn't exactly well understood. But we know that charging stations are a critical component of infrastructure to drive EV adoption. Now, last but not least, and I think the most direct metric is these outcome-based one, where the specific outcome we're looking for can be readily measured. The only thing about that is sometimes there's not a direct, or there may not be a direct causal link between utility efforts and the particular outcome of interest, or there may be other actors or entities that may be able to impact that outcome. To me, a good example of this is something like peak demand, where clearly utility efforts, programmatic efforts can impact peak demand, but there's also a lot of other ancillary actors that can impact the level of peak demand. And so if we want to set a metric or we want to set an outcome of reducing peak demand, we should just acknowledge that if we're going to measure peak demand, there's a lot of things that may impact that measurement itself. So let's see how these various types of metrics can be applied to drive improvements in performance. So the next slide. First, we're going to have the opportunity to just simply report this information. I sort of think of this as the press, right? And so the press is out there reporting on stuff, shining a light on bad behavior in the interest of trying to drive improvements in it. And so the sheer act of reporting on utility performance through these metrics should hopefully seek to improve that performance in and of itself. Over time, this can serve as a foundation for developing targets. And that's our next approach to using metrics, is through scorecards, where these metrics are tied to a target to assess the relative performance of a utility. Now, obviously, this requires the ability to understand the current level of performance, as well as what level of performance would be deemed a reasonable target to achieve. But if simple reporting of performance relative to a goal or target is insufficient to motivate the improvement in performance, well, then maybe we need to assign some sort of financial incentive or a financial penalty towards the achievement of this particular outcome. And that's our last mechanism that we're here to really talk about in particular, which is performance incentive mechanisms. So let me give you a couple of current examples where these different mechanisms are in play to drive utility performance. The first one I have up on the next slide has to do with the New York Reforming the Energy Vision Initiative. Here, the commission in their, I believe it was track one order, or track 2 order, excuse me, focused on exclusively looking at performance incentive mechanisms and scorecards. And they identified a number of different topical areas in which they wanted to see improvement of utility performance. But it was really up to ultimately the utilities in their next general rate case to propose what the balance was between scorecards and PIMs, and also what those individually looked like in terms of metrics definitions, and ultimately the value that was associated with it. So here, this was an instance of a utility basically being able to come forward with its assessment of what should be just scorecards where no financial incentives were going to be delivered, for which maybe people didn't feel as comfortable with the metrics or having an ability to identify the targets, or even a sense of comfort with the amount of money you would assign to achieving those targets, relative to the PIMs where all of those conditions had to be in place. So I think it's important in this case to illustrate this example where I'm focusing on the fact that the utility is the one that came forward with this proposal relative to the staff, let's say, or the commission, because this illustrates to me an important element of PIMs, which are, look, if the utility comes forward, they may have a very self-interest in what's going to be proposed where and under what conditions. And so just be very clear that, that becomes a bit of a challenge, and I'll get into that a little bit more in a slide or two. If we go to the next slide, it illustrates an alternative approach to this, which is where the commission in Hawaii is going through just finishing up their phase 1 of their PBR proceeding. And here the staff is acknowledging an interest in having the utilities pursue all 3 of these different approaches: data reporting, scorecards, and PIMs. What I felt like was important about this proposal was the fact that customer engagement was captured as both a scorecard and a PIM. So this recognition that a particular outcome or goal may actually ultimately fall under multiple mechanisms. So in some cases, certain elements of customer engagement, we may feel comfortable identifying a target with which we want to achieve, and that represents improved performance, but we're not really sure how much value to assign to it. Alternatively, there may be other aspects of customer engagement with which we feel much more comfortable doing that. And so that sort of leads then to this idea of, well, how do we design PIMs appropriately to really drive utility performance? And in so doing, thinking about, are PIMs the right approach to driving that performance, or do we really need to think about scorecards or data reporting approaches instead? And so on the next slide, I highlight a couple of design considerations that I think regulators and policymakers should think about as they move down this path of considering PIMs relative to other approaches. First and foremost is the need to set some sort of quantitative standard of performance that promotes achievement of superior performance or penalizes very poor performance. If you're just looking to marginally increase performance, maybe you don't need to provide any financial benefits for that. Maybe simply reporting the information or setting a modest target is sufficient. But if you want to really, challenge the utility to do this, then we need to know how much it's worth. Because, and we do that through an assessment of net benefits. But let's be very clear, that sets an upper limit on the value of achieving those goals. And that then becomes a starting place for the negotiation of sharing of those benefits, because clearly not 100% of that should go back to the utility. Ratepayers need to be able to capture some of that value, or else in some respects, why are we asking and expecting the utility to improve their performance? The third aspect that I think from a design standpoint is really critical to understand goes back to a point I made earlier, that sometimes you see various metrics or outcomes falling under multiple categories. And the fact that, as a best example of this I can think of is one where you think about system efficiency. And we're obviously interested in many places in reducing peak demand as well as reducing, total energy sales through energy efficiency. But there's also an interest in potentially measuring load factor and improvements of load factor. But obviously, if you improve demand and energy, it's going to de facto have an impact on load factor. And so this is a case where if you have all 3 of those set up as PIMs, it may very well be the case that simply achieving any 2 of those goals results in the achievement of the 3rd one. And to me, that's a sense of sort of double counting the benefits and allowing the utility to be compensated for really not much effort to achieve one of them relative to the achievement of the other two. And so what this speaks to is an interest in really designing PIMs that are highly coordinated, or at least recognizing where there may be a coordinated effort needs to be undertaken to understand how do we compensate the utilities accordingly and set targets accordingly. On the next slide, there's also been a concern associated with PIMs because we're asking ratepayers to pay for these incentive mechanisms. There's a concern that these are going to have an adverse impact on rates because the benefits associated with these, and let's say they have to do with cost reductions, those are likely not going to be passed through until the next general rate case. So there's this rate increase to pay for the PIM, but the utility, the ratepayers are not able to achieve or experience and see the benefits of that performance improvement inure to them until the next general rate case. And so there's an interest in potentially limiting the overall risk to ratepayers from rate impacts, and also a concern that maybe we're just overpaying the utilities. And so one way to manage that risk is to set an overall cap on the PIM itself, or the portfolio of PIMs. I think an illustration of this is in New York, where the regulator said, look, we're willing to give up to 100 basis points. But when each of the utilities came in for their general rate cases to propose PIMs and ultimately get them approved through a negotiated settlement, we saw Con Ed, who was the first one to go through, only get about 30 to 35 basis points worth of PIMs, well below that 100 basis point ceiling. And one of the reasons that it was so low speaks to the last bullet point here, which I think I can't emphasize enough, which is there is inherent challenges in designing and negotiating effective PIMs, especially when you consider that the utility oftentimes is the data purveyor. They hold all of the information associated with performance. They oftentimes have a lot of staff and resources they can dedicate to designing and understanding that performance and designing mechanisms, designing metrics, and setting proposed targets to achieve that performance improvements. And last but not least, they oftentimes have much greater technical expertise than commissions or staff. And this isn't to shortchange commissions or staff, don't get me wrong. You guys do amazing work. But when you think about what's gone on in Rio in the UK, my understanding is there's almost 1,000 economists working on this issue of how do we set PIMs up correctly? How do we make sure we're not taking advantage of relative to the number of utility resources that are out there? And maybe actually off an order of magnitude, come to think of it, I think it's more around 100. But the point being, they oftentimes have many, many more individuals dedicated to this at the utility level than the commissions and staff do. And so if you're going to pursue these types of activities of PIMs, and you're going to put a fair amount of money on the table, you just need to recognize that you may be at a distinct disadvantage. And so this may suggest moving in a bit of a stage or structured approach. And this is where I think the New York Commission went, which was, let's start small, 30 basis points for the first utility. Next utility that comes through will design mechanisms that focus more around the 40 to 45 basis points. And then the next one that comes in will do 50 to 55 as they gain experience with designing metrics and understanding what the value proposition is. Last but not least, I wanted to leave you with a sense of, well, how successful have various approaches to PIMs been, or implementation of PIMs, in driving utility performance. And so what I'm showing you here are summarized results from Central Hudson and Gas and National Grid, who have an annual reporting requirement in New York to illustrate how they've performed relative to the goals that have been set under the PIMs that have been designed through their general rate cases. So in the first case at the top, you see Central Hudson and Gas with a lot of red. And the red represents efforts of the utility that didn't even meet the minimum performance thresholds. The result of that meant the earnings that they contributed to, the PIMs contributed only about 1.5%, 1.4% towards earnings. And the utility woefully underperformed relative to the expectations. You juxtapose that with the bottom table that shows National Grid, where all but one of these areas, the utility exceeded expectations. In fact, in most of them, they hit sort of above and beyond certainly the midpoint level. In some cases, they actually went beyond the max level. And the result of that was a contribution to earnings of almost 6.5%. So what I want to leave you with is this sense that simply implementing PIMS is not a panacea. This isn't sort of a if you build it, will they come. Instead, you have to design these PIMS in a way that obviously are intended to drive performance improvements, but you have and should recognize that the PIMS themselves may not necessarily do that. And there's lots of reasons for it. Maybe there's not enough money on the table. Maybe the targets are too high. Maybe, lots of reasons. On the flip side, the reason National Grid may be viewed as achieving these performance improvements is because the targets were too low or we overpaid them to do this. And a lot of times it's sort of in the eye of the beholder. But again, my last point just to make on this is that PIMS in and of themselves, although they certainly seek to drive performance improvements, aren't necessarily that panacea. So I will leave it at that. Look forward to answering a bunch of questions and having a more robust conversation about this.
This is Marion. Thanks so much, Pete. That was fabulous. So I want to remind folks, if they have questions, this is the chance. Raise your hand, get in there. I will say that your comments about Rio, Pete, really resonated with me. I had a chance to go to England on a trip organized by SEPA, and one of the points of frustration there was, on one hand, the utilities were feeling great because they were meeting and exceeding their performance incentive mechanisms, and on the other hand, people were concerned that maybe they had not set the targets sufficiently challenging. So that's an ongoing tension. So one of the questions that I have is how far can PIMS go in changing utility performance? Won't the return on capital always be the biggest driver of their behavior? And you suggest capping PIMS at 100 basis points. Will that be sufficient to drive change? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think as you see here in the National Grid case, if you believe that those PIMS, earning adjustment mechanisms, is another sort of pseudonym for PIMS, New York just wanted its own naming convention for it. But as you see in the National Grid case, they clearly, limited the expansion of peak demand. They saw far, greater levels of DER utilization than at least the minimum level that they were shooting for, et cetera. So I think PIMS, I want to be very clear, I do think PIMS have a role, but they're not a panacea. You're right. There are other issues at play that need to be addressed in addition to PIMS to more effectively and robustly improve utility performance. And so whether it's decoupling mechanisms, it's figuring out how to deal with CapEx, OpEx, or CapEx, TOTEX, like as in Rio. Those are clearly issues that need to augment these types of metrics-driven performance activities. But I don't think necessarily you need to have, a holistic change. Not every commission in the country, I think, wants to pursue that sort of comprehensive change. And so I do think PIMS can be effective at targeting very specific areas for improvement where those auxiliary types of issues like you talk about won't necessarily muddy the waters. I mean, I still think it's a bit of a challenge, but you can certainly identify some areas for PIMS that can be really effective.
Okay, thank you. And just one last question. Given the challenges that we all face in terms of limited time and resources, in terms of best practices, would you suggest that regulators start with something simple like data reporting as a first step?
Yes, I am a firm believer. As we've been supporting the Hawaii Commission in their PBR proceeding, the very first thing they talked about in their opening order was this sense of, look, for this year, we want to assess utility performance. And the very first thing that in supporting them, we said back to them was, so what does utility performance look like? What do you want to do? What are you gauging as good utility performance versus bad utility performance? You even have an ability to know what that performance looks like, let alone having some sense of what's good or bad. And so I completely agree with you. I think one of the most important things you can do if you want to go down this path is you need to just have some level setting, some baseline of what utility performance even looks like. And so moving down that path of either, a combination of data reporting and scorecards, the simple act of identifying these areas of interest, developing metrics for them, and collecting information and transparently putting it out there, again, I think begins the process of driving utilities towards this performance improvement, but also I think helps give regulators, policymakers, and various stakeholders in these proceedings the ability to understand then what does exceptional performance look like and what's that potentially worth achieving, therefore how much money do I want to put on the table for it. But until you can really assess that performance, it's very hard for me to suggest a commission should move all the way into, slapping a bunch of money on the table when it isn't really sure, what it's buying.
Great, that makes a lot of sense, Peter. Thank you. And we do have a couple questions from the audience, but I'm going to hold them until after Abigail's presentation, and then I can put them forward to both of you. So take it away, Commissioner Anthony.
All right. Thank you. I'm really excited to follow Peter. I think you should find that a lot of my comments that I'll make are consistent with Peter's observations and recommendations. And what I'm going to ground my comments on are the experience that we have been having in Rhode Island over the last few years. So before I get started, I just want to clarify that this presentation and my remarks are my opinions and my reactions to the experience that we've been having in Rhode Island, and don't necessarily represent those of Commissioner Gold. We actually have our chairwoman, Curran, here with me too in the same room. So their opinions may or may not be the same, and their retelling of our story may be different from mine. So please know that I'm just speaking for myself here. And we'll move on to the next slide, please. So I'm going to start by providing a short background on Rhode Island's regulatory environment for the electric utility, because I think it's important to understand as we move forward. Then I'm going to tell the story of the Rhode Island Commission's recent review of performance incentive mechanisms over the course of 2017 and 2018. And then I'm going to explain why that experience has motivated me to develop and propose principles and a standard of review for performance incentive mechanisms. So we can move ahead. So this slide captures some of the important elements of the Rhode Island power sector today. We have basically one gas electric utility, that's National Grid. It's a mid-sized company. It's fully restructured, and there's full access to competitive electric supply. There's revenue decoupling for the electric company and decoupling for the gas company as well. And the state has quite aggressive clean energy goals, and that includes a requirement for all cost-effective energy efficiency procurement. I describe that we have a pre-modern grid, and by that I mean we have a highly cost-effective volt-var optimization program, 3V0 deployed at our substations, a state-of-the-art outage management system, and we have a slug of advanced our AMR meters coming up on 20 years old. So we don't have AMI yet. But it's important to note that the Commission does not have a universal statement on performance incentive mechanisms, nor does the Commission have a statement on the role or the need for performance regulation generally. So that's where we are today. So we can move forward. In addition to the incentives that are inherent to cost of service regulation, like the return on equity or increasing volumetric sales, Rhode Island has been using utility shareholder rewards and penalties in certain areas for decades, as Peter mentioned is typical. We have a fairly mature and effective shareholder incentive for energy efficiency and penalties for service quality and customer service. And you can move forward. And I also just want to note that state law gives the utility additional remuneration that's associated with some distributed generation and long-term contract for renewable energy programs. So these are not performance incentives. They're remuneration that is not contingent on performance, but the Commission does have the authority to make these payments contingent on performance requirements in some cases, but we've yet to do so. So moving forward. All right. So while, as I mentioned, the Commission does not have a universal policy on performance incentives, the Commission has adopted guidelines and standards for the energy efficiency and demand-side management shareholder incentive. And when you read that guidance pretty closely, you can pull out a set of standards, and they include the things in this slide that performance incentives should provide clear objectives, clear and focused metrics. As Peter noted, we don't want to pay for the same thing twice accidentally. We don't want to pay for the same thing twice purposefully. And the company should focus on creating success, not figuring out where to book success. So those standards and guidelines have been applied to the design and our decision-making on the shareholder incentive for energy efficiency. But they're not, as I said, it's not universal. They're specific to that program. So moving ahead. Oh, right. So I wanted to provide an example of a performance incentive mechanism proposal that the Commission received about 2 years ago. This proposal was intended to make the utilities remuneration for the distributed generation feed-in tariff program contingent on meeting time deadlines for meter sets. So as you can see in the slide, they had certain time, days to meter set, and in which if the company met them, then they would be able to receive their remuneration. And I evaluated this proposal against those energy efficiency guidelines because there wasn't a universal policy. So, I asked myself, how am I going to evaluate this proposal for remuneration associated with distributed generation? Let me just use those energy efficiency guidelines because they're the closest we have. So we can move on. So upon examination, the Commission found that National Grid was already meeting or exceeding the targets that had been proposed in the performance incentive mechanism, and the company testified that it would not have to improve its performance in order to continue meeting those targets. The evaluation of this PIM proposal was also made difficult because the benefits to customers from achieving the target metrics was not clear, and the record did not demonstrate a quantifiable or monetizable benefit of having a meter set in 10 days versus 11 days or 12 days or 15 days, for example. In the proposal, the Commission was unable to compare the costs and the benefits of this metric. So as you can see in the slide, we rejected it unanimously. We can move ahead. So then this is sort of really the meat of our story. In 2017, the state's Ratepayer Advocacy Agency and the state's Energy Policy Office undertook what was called the Power Sector Transformation Initiative. And that initiative resulted in recommendations to modernize the utility business model and recommended the use of performance incentive mechanisms and performance-based regulation more generally. And nearly concurrent with the end of that initiative and the close of that report, National Grid filed a significant electric and gas base distribution rate case. And at the same time, sort of in just another stack of books associated with that filing, the company filed what they called a Power Sector Transformation Program that proposed various clean energy and grid modernization investments, including proposals for 15 new performance incentive mechanisms. And we can see those on the next slide. Right. So this is a table of the performance incentive mechanisms that were proposed by National Grid in this Power Sector Transformation Program. They were largely action-based incentives that were reward only and in the form of basis points. And I'm not going to describe them all. You can probably see from the titles just the range of investments, the technologies, and issues that the company was looking at. And you can move forward, Carrie. So, a few months later, the utility and about 17 settling parties filed a settlement that combined the base distribution rate case and the power sector transformation investments into a request for 3 years of distribution rates to fund general O&M expenses, including a significant addition to the company's workforce, and also investments in grid modernization technologies like communications, data management, control technologies, and other spending on other distributed energy resources like vehicle and heat electrification, a range of distributed generation, storage. And this proposal narrowed the number of PIMs and proposed 8 new performance incentive mechanisms and proposed changes to the earnings sharing mechanism that were aimed at sort of creating a performance-based regulation type of framework. So we can move on. So here are the 8 performance incentive mechanisms that were proposed in the settlement. At the top, there is a system efficiency metric, which was a reward for reducing system coincident peak demand in order to reduce capacity market costs and transmission expenses. There was a PIM proposal that was based on accelerating consumer adoption of electric vehicles by deploying charging stations and therefore resulting in accelerated greenhouse gas reductions. That the line that's called activated apartment building and disadvantaged community EVSE was about installing charging stations in certain neighborhoods on an accelerated schedule. And underneath, I referenced the capital efficiency incentive, which was a separate shared savings mechanism to drive cost reductions around capital investment. So we can move ahead. And this is an illustration of the earnings sharing mechanism that was proposed by the settling parties. Here, sharing between shareholders and customers wouldn't kick in until the company was earning its maximum return on equity on base earnings, which is the blue part of the bar, plus the maximum shareholder reward that it can earn under its energy efficiency programs. They're in green, plus the maximum reward that the utility could earn for the 8 new performance incentive proposals. They're in sort of a yellow color. So upon examining this earnings sharing mechanism proposal, the Commission found that the sharing threshold would be over 11%. It's about 11.2%, whereas existing sharing had been 50-50 shareholders to ratepayers, starting at 9.5%. So when I looked at this, what I found was that this earnings sharing mechanism, while it seemed to be attempting to include performance revenue in what the company saw as its sort of core revenue, it really wasn't achieving that. And rather, there was no additional ratepayer protection and actually gave the utility a greater and easier opportunity to earn above its allowed return on equity without sharing, because it would be able to under-earn on its base earnings and still earn above its allowed return on equity before sharing. So we can move forward. So the Commission ultimately voted on a fair number of modifications to the settlement that were ultimately accepted by the parties. The Commission unanimously rejected most of the performance incentive mechanism proposals. We did approve the peak reduction performance incentive mechanism, and we moved the shared savings around capital investment into a separate docket to give it further consideration. But the rest of the performance incentive mechanisms were rejected or accepted for just track only. We can move ahead. So when I was evaluating the performance incentive proposals that were in this settlement, I utilized the Commission's standard and guidance for the energy efficiency shareholder incentive, because as I mentioned before, that's really the only policy that the Commission had on how to evaluate shareholder incentives. And so I observed a number of common problems with the performance incentive mechanism proposals that were in this settlement, as well as the additional proposals for performance incentive mechanisms that the Commission has received before and since this settlement. Some of those common problems are that the Commission cannot compare the costs and the benefits of a performance incentive mechanism proposal. Often benefits are not well designed, and more often they're not quantified. In some cases, the cash reward to the utility is based on assumptions about qualitative benefits. We received a number of proposals in which I found that the utility already has an incentive to advance the proposed action or outcome, including incentives that are inherent to cost of service regulations, such as their return on equity on capital investment, or the benefits that a utility receives from increasing its volumetric sales. We also had a number of proposals in which the performance incentive mechanism wouldn't hold the utility accountable to outcome or performance. For example, it would receive the incentive for just completing the action, whether the action had better or worse performance. There was no performance element of it, I should say. And in other proposals, I've viewed a lack of a clear connection between the proposed action and the metric, or the action and the purported benefits. So we can move ahead, Carrie. So I wanted to give you an example of another proposal that the Commission has received that had some of these problematic elements. This is a short explanation of a proposal to reward the utility with 2% of the program budget for what we consider to be our non-wires alternative program here in Rhode Island, which we call system reliability procurement. And the utility was proposing to receive 2% of the budget for identifying areas where large non-electric vehicle public transportation fleets are located, and making that location information available on the company's system data portal, which are maps that are available to the public. And the primary problem that I ran up against when evaluating this proposal is that it was difficult and impossible, in fact, to compare the costs and benefits of this action. The company argued that the benefit of making this location data available on their map was that greater availability of information regarding potential installation locations for EV charging stations would be made to stakeholders, and that they would be increasing the availability of information on potential areas where non-electric vehicles may be converted to electric vehicles. But the proposal didn't provide any quantified benefits, and the company hadn't made any effort to quantify the benefits. There was also very little analysis of what the value of this information to third parties might be, or what the potential savings to ratepayers might be by making this information more valuable. So at the end of my analysis of this proposal, the question I asked myself was, if the company has not demonstrated that the information is valuable, how can the Commission determine that it is worth rewarding the utility for providing it? This is just one example of sort of my thinking as I examined these proposals for performance incentive mechanisms. So you can go forward, Carrie. All right. So over the course of receiving nearly 24 proposals for performance incentive mechanisms, with the Commission providing our rationale for rejecting them, it eventually became clear that the Commission needed a more efficient process for providing the utility and stakeholders with clear, complete, and consolidated guidance on the Commission's policy for the appropriate use and design of performance incentive mechanisms. So I worked with a small team of staff here at the PUC and the help of an outside expert to draft guiding principles to support stakeholders' development of performance incentive mechanisms and guide the Commission's review of PIM proposals. So in short, what I was trying to do is establish a standard of review for performance incentive mechanisms. And I think the timing here in Rhode Island is prime for adopting a clear standard of review such as this. Over the next 12 months or so, our Commission will be considering several billions in new spending and investment, things like grid modernization, advanced metering, and some significant long-term contracts for renewable energy. So I see us as at a point in time where we have the real opportunity to hold the utility accountable to the creation of benefits from new investments, and share some of that risk with ratepayers. And I also want to be clear that the applicability of the principles that I propose is not just to the electric utility at all, but certainly can and should be applied to all of the utilities that we regulate. Go ahead, Carrie. I'm wrapping up. So, all right. So I had 5 principles that we developed, and I'm not going to go through them in detail. Hopefully, you'll be able to keep these slides and look at them. But I want to clarify that, as Peter said in his work with Hawaii, other commissions have articulated or started by articulating a robust vision for performance regulation and identifying their commission's priorities for the target areas or goals of performance incentive mechanisms. So Peter suggested, you start by saying, identifying the greenhouse gas reductions or peak demand reductions are the priority for your commission. What I'm trying to do with these proposed principles is a little different in that it's establishing the regulatory standard of review for utility proposals and showing parties and counterparties that come before us what kind and the quality of information and evidence that the Commission needs to receive in order to make decisions about their performance incentive mechanism proposals. So in other words, we're trying to show the parties how to make their case. And we did consider whether the Commission should start by identifying priority areas as opposed to these principles, and I chose not to do that. As a Commission, we may rethink that, but I wanted to start with sort of the guide rails on how to build a case. We developed these principles in the context of a discussion document that spends quite a bit of time and has a fairly long discussion on the role of different kinds of benefits and how and whether the utility should be rewarded for delivering qualitative versus quantitative versus what we call cash or sort of monetizable benefits, and the different levels and allocations of risks that are associated with those different kinds of benefits. And this was a thought process that was involved, I think, on my part, a lot of soul searching, but also helped clarify a lot of questions about, when is it appropriate to reward the utility, to pay the utility out for delivering on qualitative benefits. Carrie, you can go to the next slide, and then I'll. So, like I said, so some of the key points of the 5 principles that I developed are that proponents of performance incentive mechanism proposals must establish that the utility lacks an incentive or has a disincentive to advance the public interest. They need to establish that the utility is underperforming or that there is potential for improved performance to deliver new benefits. The proposal must give the Commission the ability to compare costs and benefits. The proposal must allow the Commission to understand how risks and rewards are allocated. We must be able to understand how different types of benefits carry different levels of risk. We establish that the proportion of benefits that accrue to customers should increase over time, and that proponents of performance incentive mechanism proposals need to be making an evidentiary case for the marginal incentive necessary to motivate the desired performance. And finally, that performance incentive mechanisms should not prescribe specific actions, but rather we are looking for high-level performance incentive mechanisms that motivate the utility to continuously seek the lowest cost or most cost-effective way to achieve the target. So this full document is available. Hopefully you'll be able to access that link later. And Carrie, can you just go to the last slide? And so our next steps are putting these proposed principles and the concepts that surround them out for comment. We've just started seeking stakeholder comment today. Ultimately, I would like to work towards a guidance document in which the Commission adopts principles for making decisions on performance incentives to guide our decision making. And finally, our Commission is currently taking another look at the earnings sharing mechanism or shared savings mechanism for capital investment that we originally reviewed in the settlement rate case. So that's our experience in a nutshell.
Thank you very much, Abigail. That was terrific. And as you can all see, we've been spending a lot of time thinking this through. So we just have a few more minutes, but we did have a couple of questions from the audience. The first one I think I'll direct to Abigail, and that is, Abigail, where are the costs of implementing these programs recovered?
Yeah, I mean, very practically, when in our rate case, the utility had suggested a separate tracking mechanism to recover the costs of the performance incentive mechanisms, and I think that tracking mechanism they were suggesting would be, rolled into your distribution rate. I think we're going to reconcile that up, but that will be recovered through distribution rate. Our energy efficiency performance incentive, shareholder incentive, is recovered through our energy efficiency program charge currently.
Yeah, thank you. And another question, and this one might be for you, Pete, is do you have experience or do you know if PIMs are used or can be used as penalties for not achieving goals?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think Commissioner Anthony showed a couple of examples there, I think early in our presentation, that illustrated that you can have symmetry, right? You can certainly hold the utility accountable for very poor performance and financially penalize them, just as you can compensate them for exceptional performance. And that's really a decision on the part of each commission as to whether it wants to make them symmetric or not. There's talk in Hawaii, I believe, of potentially making them symmetric. New York stated early on that they were interested in just one-sided PIMs. So again, I think it's sort of up to each commission to decide how it wants to address that issue of, financial rewards and penalties. But the option is certainly there within PIMs to do either or both.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we've had some of that same conversation in Rhode Island as we're looking to, encourage the utility to think about innovation. Then perhaps the PIMs should only go one way, and that's something that we're spending a lot of time debating. So I think that we are about at time. I believe that I'm not stepping out too far on a limb to say that Commissioner Anthony would be willing to take questions. If people have questions and haven't had time to get them in today, you could shoot her an email, and I suspect, Pete, you'd be willing to do the same?
Yes, my contact information is on the last slide of my part of the deck today. So yes, feel free to reach out and ask your questions. I get funded by the Department of Energy to do just that. So happy to take the time to do it.
I know I will be in touch. So I just want to thank NARUC and the Center for Partnership and Innovation, and also a big thanks to Peter and Abigail for a really terrific content-rich presentation. And we look forward to continuing the dialogue on this topic. I think we're going to all be talking about it a lot in the future. So with that, anything else, Carrie, on your end?
That's so great. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We hope to see you in May. We had a slight tweak in our the date for our May webinar. It's up there, May 16th. We hope to see you there. And thank you so much, Commissioner Gold, Commissioner Anthony, and Peter. Have a great day, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.